Welcome to COIQ, where you learn how health innovators maximize their success. You're working on something big, something life-saving, something world-changing, yet 95% of health innovations fail, and real lives are on the line. That's why launching is not enough. Commercialization is the most critical, yet overlooked stage of the innovation process. Through candid conversations with health innovators, early adopters, and influencers, you'll learn the 5 components of the COIQ early adoption strategy. So if you want to change lives and dominate your market, why not give your innovation the best chance to succeed? I'm your host, Dr. Roxy, founder of Legacy DNA, an international best-selling author of How Health Innovators Maximize Market Success. And now, let's join the conversation and maximize your success. Welcome back, COIQ listeners. On today's episode, I have Dr. Erkan Hassan, who has been in the healthcare industry for many decades. I know I'm telling your age a little bit, but been in healthcare for a long time, and is an independent healthcare consultant. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Roxy. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
So before we get started, I always like to just kind of level set and have you do a little bit of an introduction about your background and what you do to kind of give our audience some context.
Yeah, sure. That's great. I am formally trained as a clinical pharmacist. I got my pharmacy degree, my doctor of pharmacy degree, and went to work at academic medical centers, spent the first half of my career at academic medical centers, primarily working in the ICU, working with the intensivists and critical care nurses to manage the drug therapy of these very critically unstable patients. And went the academic route, got promoted to associate professor, the whole scholarly activities, the professional service, that teaching. And then switched gears and was employee number 17 at VisiQ, which was a startup company for telemedicine for the ICU, trying to leverage a limited resource. And was there, we built that company. I was employee number 17. We built up the product, the solution, the number of beds covered about 7,000 ICU beds, all adult patients in the US. And my most recent title there was Director of Clinical Affairs, where I was responsible for identifying, prioritizing, launching, and growing the clinical informatics strategy. And so, and again, most recent shift as an independent consultant, what I do is I try to identify the clinical challenges that health systems and startup companies face using evidence-based clinical data to sort of create innovative, intelligent solutions to really drive patient-centered quality outcomes. And it's really coupling my clinical expertise with business skills that I've learned over time. I think the best way to describe this is, you know, my fire in the belly, my goal of really what I want to do when I grow up. Yeah. I really want to build or create a quality solution that really impacts the quality of care for the patient in the bed. That's sort of my driving fire in the belly.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Somebody's got to do it. So it's interesting because there's so many factors or things to consider when you're bringing an innovation to market. But healthcare is so unique. And I think that one of those things that makes it unique is that the clinical evidence is like a critical factor in being able to be successful, whereas other industries don't have to, pay attention to that. So our show is all about helping health innovators, go from an idea to full market adoption. And so I wanted to ask you, as you scan the landscape, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've identified when you're looking through the clinical outcomes lens?
So that's a really good question, Roxy. And if I may, let me step back for just go a level higher with that. I mean, I think there's actually three parts to this problem, in my view. And I'm not sure if they're independent pillars or overlapping Venn diagrams, but the three parts that I see, number one is obviously the business challenge, that a company wants to be a commercial success. And I think that you spend a good part of your book on the challenges, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But it's the business challenge of becoming a commercial success. And it's either an offshoot of that or separate pillars of part of that, because I think the other two parts are, number one, are the clinical outcomes piece of it. And, David Nash, who's the founding dean of the Jefferson College of Population Health, he just retired as the founding dean of that, has this great quote. I give him full credit for it, but I steal it all the time. Yep. Which is, no outcome, no income.
Yep.
And again, we'll come back to, I want to list the three things, then we'll come back and talk about each one of these in a little bit more detail, I think. And then the third factor, I think, really is health system workflows. And really defining the roles and responsibilities of healthcare, identifying the challenges that healthcare faces, and how do all these three interlace, and really how do you take these in terms of clinical and business skills and bridge them together. So that's kind of how I see it. From the business challenge, let's talk about the business challenge aspect of this. So there's three parts. I don't know if it's pillars or overlapping Venn diagrams, but to be a commercial success, you and I both know there are companies out there that build solutions looking for a problem. Yeah. And that's really not the best way to do it. And so that's one issue with the business challenge to become a commercial success. The second area, I think, is in terms of co-development. And I've seen many companies where they build their solution or their product sort of in isolation. And I think one of the things you need to, it's a mind shift with healthcare, because you really have to build it the way clinicians think. If you don't have that way clinicians think to overlap it with the clinical presentation, again, you're going to fall short, and you need to be concerned about that. And then finally is the clinical validation. So again, that part of the Venn diagram that we need to go talk about the Venn diagram. And I think one of the best way to sum it up, as I see it in terms of the business challenge, is that a lot of companies will think of it as a product out there. And I think that's a mistake when it comes to healthcare, because what healthcare is looking for is not a product. They're looking for a solution. And if you continue with a product, that may not be solving my problem. And so what I really need from you is a proven solution of how do I incorporate this into my system. So that's the one business challenge piece. Let's talk about the clinical outcomes piece of this. The clinical validation piece is very critical. No outcome, no income. Yep. And I think a lot of companies are surprised that, we have this great widget, let's go sell it. And without, the very first question you're going to get is, show me the data. Because think about it, if you're a new company trying to get traction, no one is going to take a risk on you without clinical data. And, I don't mean that it needs to be a large 2,000 patient randomized clinical trial, but you do need to show a pilot to demonstrate that what you're offering really does what you say it's going to do. But that does entail a number of things. It entails writing the study protocol, getting IRB, going through the IRB. It does not mean you may or may not need to get informed consent based on what you're really trying to demonstrate with it. But having that IRB piece of paper, I think, is very important. Getting the data, analyzing the data, having go, no-go decisions, identifying the metrics you're going to measure and assess for success or failure is important. And again, this does not have to be a 2-year study. I think some of these can be done in very short periods of time, 90 days of once you start enrolling in getting data.
So let's pause for just a moment and talk about that. Like, when does an innovator need to develop this? And how much is it, kind of a progressive thing? So you're kind of touching on this, but I want to just pause and kind of drill a little bit deeper into it, because I hear this question all the time. How much evidence and clinical validation do I have to have before I go to market? How much of it can be a little bit more ambiguous when I'm approaching someone maybe as a partner, and the way I'm going to get that evidence is going to be through that pilot program. So let's kind of just talk about when, and then what does that look like? Because I think you're doing a great job for our listeners, kind of framing that this is what you might need before you go to market. And it would, in this context, right, we talk about sample size and the type of study, and then what you would need maybe in a pilot or in some of your first customers.
My personal opinion is, if you're going to sell to health systems and you're going to go to health systems and do this, unless you're going to partner with them, you need the data up front.
Okay.
No, especially if you're a small startup company that you're trying to get risk takers, early adopters to purchase what you're doing.
Yep.
You have to have some clinical data to show that. And so, for example, I think it really depends on what the solution really is. So, for example, if you have a predictive algorithm that says, I can predict length of stay in the hospital or in the ICU, then, and I can, this algorithm will predict length of stay. Well, then I need to go to a hospital and say, will you partner with us to pilot this so that I can, and let me back up. So I've built this algorithm. I pulled back 2,000 patients. I analyzed their data, and I had some engineers build this algorithm. I know what the key components are. I validated it. I developed it and validated it in-house.
Yeah.
I have no outside data.
Yep.
Before you go to a site, if you go to a site to sell this algorithm, they're going to say, where's your data? Show me that what you actually built has been validated, that it actually works. And so I think that has to happen before you make any sales.
So what about the structure of that? Does it need to be a certain population, a certain sample size? Is there some specific metrics or markers? Because I think that this is also a really important discussion, because there's a lot of pitfalls with this, because, most of the people that are the health innovators are not the clinicians. They're not thinking the way you are, and in what you're talking about in your experience. They're thinking of more of the tech. And so the last thing you want is them to do these studies, but be missing some key parts of the data to where it was wasted time, wasted money, because it's incomplete, or it's not what those potential customers are looking for to actually give them assurance of, patient safety and efficacy.
Excellent points. I think that is right on the mark. And one of the biggest problems I see is biting off more than you should chew. And I think the first step is, this is what we say it does. This is how we're going to validate that it does what we say it does. Period. That's all you're trying to do.
Yeah.
I think don't worry about the other populations. That's growth down the road.
Yep.
I think how large of a sample size, that's simple to figure out how much of a sample size you really need. That's biostatisticians can tell you the sample size you need for that.
Yep.
But don't get to the point. So I'll give you a good example. I was recently working with a company that has an algorithm that can predict interventions. It predicts interventions somewhere between 4 to 6 hours before the clinical intervention actually occurs. They need to do a clinical validation. And they're like, well, how do we show that we avoided all these interventions? And the first step, because they have not done any clinical validation yet, my response was, you don't need to yet. What you need to do is show when your algorithm goes off, 6 hours later, there actually is an intervention. And if your algorithm does not go off, 6 hours later, there is no intervention.
Right.
So that's the first step. And I go in armed with that to say, look, Mr. and Ms. Health System, this is what we say our algorithm does. This is the data showing that 95% of the time it actually did identify these patients. Now, what we do with it, and that gets to the workflows piece, which is the third pillar. We'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Does that
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. But it, makes me think of another question. So what you're touching on in my mind is, kind of around this MVP. And I know people have different perspectives. They say, oh, you can't do MVP in healthcare because, patients' lives are at risk. And I think it depends on how you're defining MVP. And so I think what you touched on is, for health innovators, you don't have to, if you're thinking about a product or a solution, maybe you go to market with a minimal feature set, and then you do your studies and your validation on those minimal features, and that helps you with the timing and the financial cost of that and being able to go to market rather than having, 20 or 50 because you think that's going to make it seem more attractive, but then it takes you longer and it costs you more money, and then you don't have any money to go to market.
You don't have to boil the ocean.
Right. Yeah.
And it gets back to what problem are you trying to solve? And I need validation that what you say your algorithm does or your product does, does it.
Yep.
And so you don't need to boil the ocean, especially the first leg out. In my experience, after you do the pilot study, you end up with a bunch more questions than you started with.
And that's okay, right?
That's okay.
Like, give our audience permission that is okay.
It's okay. Because you know what? You need to survive to be able to address those questions. You need to prioritize them and then figure out which ones really make the best business sense and workflow sense to really go to.
Mm-hmm. Hey, it's Dr. Roxy here with a quick break from the conversation. Do you want your innovation to succeed? To change lives, to shape the future of healthcare? I want that for every health innovator, which is why I invented COIQ, an evidence-based framework to take your innovation from an idea to startup to full market adoption. If you're not sure where you are in the commercialization process, take the free assessment now at drroxy.com/score. Don't miss out on impacting more lives just because you have a low COIQ score. The free assessment is at drroxy.com/score. That's drroxie.com/SCORE. And now let's jump back into the conversation. So a lot of folks, sell a technology solution to a health system and walk away. What are some of the biggest challenges that an innovator might have after a sale?
So that's the third pillar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The third pillar is the health system workflow. We can talk about that, but I've got some other stuff on the second pillar still.
Okay. All right. Well, let's do it.
No, whichever one you want. We can go to either one.
Listen, you're my guest. It's your show. You decide.
I think one of the other, in terms of the clinical outcome and the clinical validation piece, I think one of the things as you address what problem am I really trying to identify, you have to ask, what are the problems faced by healthcare systems?
Yeah.
And one of the biggest problems is assimilation and managing clinical presentation.
Okay, let's talk more.
Because data is scattered throughout various sources. There's no one place that pulls it out together. In fact, there may be key data elements that are missing. Mm-hmm. So I've got to gather data from all these disparate systems, gathered from a variety of scattered systems. How do I bring it all together, incorporating my solution that it makes sense to solve the clinician's problem and take care of that patient? Again, my fire in the belly, how do I improve the care of that patient laying in the bed? I'm thinking of the patient laying in the bed. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times the data presentation lacks patient context.
Okay.
I'll give you a good example of that. in a lot of CPOE systems, there's drug-drug interactions, right? As a drug guy, they do the drug-drug interactions, right? And a clinician will get a notification of a drug-drug interaction. I read a recent paper. They looked at 3 million drug-drug interaction notifications. 2.8 million of them, 91%, were overridden.
Why?
Several reasons. One, alert fatigue. These things just keep popping up. Could be because the chart is not updated. So in other words, if the patient had renal disease that would pop up the drug notification, the acute renal failure has resolved itself, but it was never taken off the problem list. So the computer still sees it as active and pops it up, a variety of reasons. So the question becomes, how do you fix this? Mm-hmm. And I think, in my opinion, but one way is to provide patient context to it. So if you have a patient, you're on warfarin and I'm adding trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole as an antibiotic, and I get a notification that this drug interaction increases your INR bleeding tendency.
Yep.
Okay, I got it. And it's interesting, the studies that have looked at dismissals of drug-drug interactions, a lot of them you have to put in a reason why you're dismissing it. The most common reason that the clinicians dismiss drug-drug interaction notifications is, yes, I'm aware of it, I got it, click, done. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Dismiss it. But what if, as a clinician, you see on the notification, Roxy has a warfarin trimethoprim sulfa drug interaction, it's going to increase her INR. And her most recent INR from 3 hours ago was 2.8. And in that same screen, so now it gives me patient context. I don't have to go someplace else to look for it, right? Mm-hmm. I have it all right there. And what if on the same screen, I can then say, okay, cancel that order. I want to order something else, all from that same patient context screen. So
yeah, again.
So my point is data presentation. I think as you build your innovative solution, you need to consider data presentation, and it gets into the whole risk stratification, which we can talk about later, but what I call the 10-second rule. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at a screen of, and I don't care if it's 20 patients, 200 patients, or 2,000 patients, and you're notifying me that these 20 patients are all red alerts, right? Well, within 10 seconds, I need to be able, as a clinician, what I want to know is who's the number one patient I want to look at, I have to look at, where do I need to look, and what am I supposed to look for? So if I don't know, if I see a screen of 50 patients, 20 patients, whatever it may be, patient 35 may be the number one patient I have to go to. I don't have time to go to patient 1, 2. They're all red, but how do I know where the priority is? And if it doesn't meet that 10-second rule, it doesn't work in my mind.
So do you see this as something that is affecting the health innovator in their product development phase to make sure that they're taking that into consideration? Or do you see that as something that is really important after the sale and making sure they have an understanding of the environment to make sure that they're getting the outcomes that they hope to get from their solution, or both?
The short answer is it's pre. I think you go out the door with it. I think if you go out, let me give you the long answer. The 10-second rule, I have not seen anybody that meets the 10-second rule. I have not seen any company out there and small, medium, large companies that meets the 10-second rule. And so that's a huge advantage. If you can walk into a place and say, this is how we risk stratify, and I can show you who the top person you need to look at is, and who to look at, where to look, and what to look at. Mm-hmm. That's the 10-second rule triad. To me, going in after the fact, because it goes into our third pillar, which is the health system workflow. And you have to have that as part of it. So with health system workflow, and it gets back to the question you asked earlier, if I have a technology, so I've built, I'm a healthcare innovator company, I've built this thing, and I have my clinical validation. I show that I can predict length of stay in these patients.
Right.
Here you go, Roxy, as head of a 5-hospital health system, I would like you to buy this. And you say, yes, I'd like to buy it. And we install it in all your 5 hospitals.
Yep.
The outcomes, the clinical outcomes, do not automatically transfer from one program to the other simply by adding on technology. It does not happen by simply installing and turning on a switch. You may be more efficient, but you're not going to be more effective. And no one pays you to be efficient at doing the wrong thing.
Right.
So even though you have strong leadership acceptance, even though you have a strong project team, and even though you have clinical buy-in, these are all good starting points, but alone will not guarantee success without going back to the topic of the pillar, which is health system workflows. How do I improve the workflow? How do I streamline it? One of the biggest problems in healthcare is those frontline clinicians are very busy, and adding more things for them to do without taking stuff away is not going to help. It's only going to hinder. So I think the innovator has to think about what, and again, I've seen this happen with companies that say, and it's the difference between having a product and having a solution. Because the solution is going to encompass all of these things, that all 3 pillars that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
It's going to say, this is how you use it. And it may vary from site to site, right? We may have to customize it a little bit. But if you did it right, the customization should be little tweaks, not major configuration changes.
Right. Which is a huge pitfall, but yes.
Right. and so, and even within a hospital, the 5th floor may do it differently from the 3rd floor from the ER, from the ED, right? But it might be a little bit differently, but aligning those people and process, that what I call the clinical transformation change, that's what you really need to have to have it adopted and show the frontline clinician how it's going to make their job easier, not worse. And so simply going to a site, in my opinion, going to a site and say, here's the technology, turn it on, boom, you're going to fail. In my opinion, you will fail.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's so critical. These, the health innovators, put their heart and soul in their solution, their innovation, and they're going to market. And it's such a win that needs to be celebrated when you get these new customers. But the fact remains is that if those new customers, those early adopters, don't become raving fans, they will not help you move through the adoption curve to get the future customers. So you might have won a few, but if that account is not managed through the lens that you're talking about, then you're not going to have raving fans. You might have sold a solution that's not being used. Call 6 months and find out nobody's using it. It's all installed, or they may be using, a 10th of what the capabilities are. And so what do you suggest to health innovators? What do they need to prepare for, both financially, like what resources that they need to plan for, both finances and people, to be able to, after the sale, support that implementation and execution all the way to getting the clinical validation to where it can be a successful case study for future business?
Yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, you want these initial sites to be your reference sites. You want to be able to take prospects there and say, here, call up St. Joe's, talk to Dr. Roxy, and ask her what she thinks of the system.
Yep.
of our solution, right?
Yep.
I think you have to have the clinical validation piece before you do that, before you go out. And the other piece that we haven't talked about, which I think is part of this, and again, so the clinical validation piece, the data presentation piece, the 10-second rule, but the other piece of this that I think is also important is the reporting piece. And going out without reporting, I think, is an error as well. Now, I realize I'm dumping a lot of stuff you have to have before you walk out the door. But again, you don't have to boil the ocean.
Right, right.
But I think reporting, to be able to assess what what you say your solution is doing is actually doing. And part of the reporting is also part of your clinical validation, the metrics that you've identified. And I think of metrics in 4 big buckets. There's clinical metrics, there's financial metrics, there's operational metrics of how well does it operate within the system, and then there's staff and patient satisfaction metrics. And as
quadruple aim.
I was just going to get to that. I think the question, as you're building your clinical validation, you have to ask, you have to go through each one of those and have your list and generate a list of all the possible metrics under each one of those 4 categories. And there will be duplication, right?
Yep.
There'll be one metric that will transcend multiple categories. And then there will be, again, don't boil the ocean. You got to have your MVP metrics that are really going to get back to, this is the problem I'm trying to solve that I've identified. And these metrics are key to showing that, not the rest of them. So you need to identify that up front and go out there. Now, as you build the solution, one of the questions, if a health system is going to want, is an output reporting, how well are we doing? What's our assessment of this? Not only initially, but over time, longitudinally. And we all know what happens when a new project starts. And we also know what happens. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Especially with positive results, a lot of encouragement. Roll it out everywhere. Let's go. But we also know what happens when you take your foot off the accelerator.
Yep.
And so not having the reporting and be able to assess what happens longitudinally with your program to see that it's still working is also important. As long as we're talking about reporting, let's talk about some other things. What most people think about when we say reporting assessment of outcomes is reporting to the C-suite, the buyers, that this is the results of our solution and our collaboration with you, because it does have to be a partnership and a collaboration.
Right.
But these are the results to the C-suite. But what I submit is, don't forget the frontline clinicians. So you want to report, for lack of a better term, upstream and downstream. And oftentimes we forget to circle back to the people that are actually doing the work at the front line and say, this is the impact you're having with this solution, and we're going to show you this. The third part of it, there's 4 parts. The third part is, I, as a health system, have bought your solution. Now I want to be able to compare my hospital A to hospital B, to hospital C to hospital D, right? I want to compare where is my problem area? If I just get overall, I'm at 80% compliance with whatever system I'm in, that doesn't tell me that hospital D is at 40% and counteracting the 90% hospital A is at. So I need to find where my problem areas are. And then in addition, I want to know, how does my health system compare, how do my community hospitals compare to other community hospitals, my other competitors in my area? How does my academic sites compare to other academic sites? How does my 300-bed hospital compare to other 300-bed hospitals? I don't want to compare myself to an 800-bed hospital.
Right.
And how do I compare geographically from the Northeast to the Southwest? How does that compare? None of that happens without a reporting mechanism over time that you need to to consider. And the final area is, I think, the reporting that you build into this helps in terms of identifying areas for improvement, areas you're not doing well in for whatever reason, but areas to focus on in the future to improve compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's just really that's a fundamental practice, I think, for anything that we do today, right? You know, design, build, test, measure, and just for continuous improvement. And so it's interesting to even think about it from the outcomes piece and how important that is.
I don't know what your experience has been, but mine is a lot of times innovative companies forget about the reporting piece, and they're like, oh yeah, we'll have some reporting but don't really think about what are the elements I really need to put into it.
Yeah, it's definitely an afterthought in many cases, or it's really lean, a little too lean, and not. I think what you're describing is something that's really important to think about, even in the development process, right? Planning for that type of data collection and segmentation and presentation to customers as well as to yourself as the innovator, to be able to see how successful it's going. I think that, as an health innovator, and you're in this startup, you typically have limited resources.
Yes.
And right. And you've got this window of opportunity that you're kind of up against. And so you're kind of thinking of, what is it that I have to have? What do I need to spend my money on? And I think the conversation that we are having today very often, too often, gets part of the down the road. And I think that it becomes a pitfall for success.
I agree with you completely. And if MVP is a dirty word, I'm sorry, but it's part of MVP in my mind.
Right. Exactly. So, as we wrap up here, there's so many people that are listening today that are innovators, that are in the trenches, or hospital systems that may be innovating within, that are still even internally experiencing a lot of the same challenges that we talked about, or they're on the receiving side of this health innovator bringing a solution to them. Is there any other advice that you have for them before we wrap up?
Wow. To throw more kindling on the fire to stoke it even further. Early on, when we first started doing the telemedicine for the ICU solution, that would sell solely on clinical outcomes. You could do it just on clinical outcomes. That environment no longer exists. And I think everyone hopefully is aware that you have to sell it on clinical and financial outcomes, and you have to include the financial component to any project that you do with this. So if you're not looking at that, I think that would be my last piece of advice. In fact, I just recently saw an article of, the big thing in the news these days are how drug companies price their new innovative drugs. Mm-hmm. And the exorbitant price for these. Well, I just read an article, and there are some countries in Europe that price their new pharmaceuticals based on quality life years gained by the solution. So the pricing of the drug is based on what impact on quality life years will it impact the patients taking the drug. So things that are more lifestyle changes to improve, will probably have less cost if based on that, versus something that's a huge lifesaver kind of thing. Mm-hmm, so there's and obviously the FDA is looking at ROI and cost analysis in anything that they consider, especially with the drug aspect of it. So that would be my last piece of advice.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our listeners today. How can folks get a hold of you if they want to reach out to you to do any type of follow-up conversations?
Thank you for that. I think the easiest way is on my LinkedIn profile, Erkan Hassan. On my LinkedIn, will have access to my webpage. I also, if you look at my activities, I post a lot of articles. I have a monthly blog newsletter. They're all posted on LinkedIn that you can download, read, throw away, or subscribe to my monthly blog with that as well.
Erkan, thank you so much. I feel like, we could just have this conversation for days. So we'll have to schedule another episode. There's so much to talk about.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. I know you're busy working to bring your life-changing innovation to market, and I value your time and your attention. To save time and get the latest episodes on your mobile device automatically, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate everyone who's been sharing the show with friends and colleagues. See you on the next episode of COIQ.